With both Vanilla and Burning Crusade raids fully ranked from best to worst, my eyes are now set on WoW's second expansion pack, Wrath of the Lich King. A huge fan favorite and my all-time favorite expansion pack, Wrath continued on with Burning Crusade's more complex and defined raid boss mechanics, focusing heavily on mobility and utility more so than ever before. Wrath easily helped produce some of WoW's greatest raids and sadly some of its all-time biggest stinkers. That's right, even the highest highs eventually come crashing back down to the surface. I'll be ranking all 9 raids from best to worst, gauged on their overall quality at the time of release, from boss design to area layout. Keep in mind this is my opinion as always, but I'm stoked to hear what your favorite and least favorite Wrath raids were. Alright, with that all out of the way, let's get this started with the very best the Lich King has to offer. It really shouldn't be that big of a surprise that Ulduar would take my best rating spot for this list. Its feats are well known among the player base, even to those who may not enjoy it as much as others. Right out the gate, Ulduar has some really approachable raid design, from its really nice looking titanic structure to its elemental hallways that represent the titans housed within them. Everything has a very charming and at times surprising set of design choices. And overall the atmosphere is extremely well executed, having a very isolated and often frightening vibe to it. In addition to its design comes its layout, which Ulduar does exceptionally well. Ulduar is at times very linear, but it's the optional doorways to other bosses that gives players the option on how they want to tackle this titanic prison, promoting exploration as well as giving options for those that want a bit more challenge. Of course, it's the boss designs that really got people to keep coming back to Ulduar. Having a solid difficulty curve that feels extremely progressive and fair, Uld's bosses ramped up in difficulty more and more, all while introducing some pretty fun and solid mechanics for players to master. But the cherry on top of this magnificent cake is the addition of the hard mode boss encounters, which allowed players to return after mastering an encounter and attempt to defeat it in a much more challenging form. Much more than a simple swap to heroic or mythic difficulty like we have nowadays, players had to discover the key to unlocking each hard mode before attempting them. This could range from not destroying the Serenite Vapors in the General of Essex encounter, or pushing the button in the Memron encounter. The hard modes often added huge layers to existing boss fights, and most of the time required the raiders have full knowledge of the original encounter before defeating them. Yarg-Saron Zero Lights and Hodir hard mode come to mind. I spouted enough about this raid, but it's no joke that Ulduar is easily Wrath's greatest raid, and possibly the very best raid World of Warcraft has ever seen. With Wrath of the Lich King coming to an end, it was finally time to challenge and defeat the aforementioned King of the Undead himself, and the raid of Icecrown Citadel was a great place to do it. A frigid fortress housing some of the most nefarious minions the Lich King has, ICC had a lot to live up to in the eyes of the player base, but in my opinion it did it with flying colors. Icecrown has a pretty obvious design featuring hallways and balconies, boasting some very frigid but also haunting set pieces to make this truly feel like the lair of Arthas the Lich King. Its design is mostly linear until the last section, where players are tasked with entering 3 unique wings, all featuring a theme centered around the bosses housed within, such as the Crimson Halls, which contain the dark and vampiric undead blood elves known as the Sand Lane. The layout generally plays it safe, but is still solid enough not to bore players who found themselves pushing through its depths for loot and victory. The boss design, much like a lot of Wrath of the Lich King's bosses, was complex and rewarding to learn and master, featuring some of my all-time favorite bosses like the Green Dragon Velythria, an untraditional boss that requires the raid to heal her instead of killing her to full while holding off waves of undead, or Blood Queen Lenethel, which has players becoming vampires, in which they become a lot stronger, but now have to spread the vampiric affliction or be controlled by the Sand Lane Queen. Of course, all of this culminates with the final encounter against Arthas himself, and man, is it still one of the most epic encounters I've ever done, especially on Heroic. I mean, getting out of Defile, while also killing incoming Valkyries, was pretty intense, and don't get me started on those awesome transition phases. Man, it looks so cool. If all of that isn't enough, the solid story and character interactions like the Alliance side version of the Saurfang encounter make for some tragic and engaging content to help pull you deeper into this dread fortress, known as Icecrown Citadel. While Blizzard did some pretty new and innovative things in Wrath, it wasn't always that way. The launch raid Naxxramas is a perfect example of that, and while it may not be original, being a vanilla 40-man raid first, its return was still met with a huge amount of positive feedback from the fans. For a lot of people, Naxx 40 wasn't a very doable option. Keep in mind that it was one of the most difficult and hard to approach raids in the history of the game, and during vanilla, catching up to current content and then being invited to said content was quite a challenge. With all that being said, Blizzard opted to move Naxx to Northrend in Wrath and toned down its infamous difficulty in favor of giving players a second chance at attempting this beast of a raid. If you ever watched my vanilla raid ranking video, you'd know I think very highly of the OG Naxxramas, and a lot of its content transferred to Wrath flawlessly, namely, its fantastic raid design. If I'm being honest, Naxx has probably the greatest raid design in the history of this game, tied with Karazhan. It's very approachable and rewarding layout-wise for players who are struggling with certain bosses or want to explore something new. Not to mention the set pieces all still look really great in my opinion, though Blizzard did update several of them with the move to Wrath. If I had any gripes about the new variant of Naxx, it would be the almost worthlessness of the 10-man version, which had loot that was barely better than 5-man heroic dungeons, aside from Kel'Thuzad, meaning you really only wanted to do this place for the key for Malygos off Saffron and the final boss. The only other problem I have with this remake is that while it did adjust the content to be suitable for current raid cores, it stripped several of the more unique mechanics from the OG bosses, such as being teleported to the side room during the Hygen encounter. Overall, these are minor gripes, however, as even in my revisit to Naxx and Wrath, I found myself having a lot of fun in this fantastic little piece of WoW history. While Naxx was a solid entry for Wrath of the Lich King, it's very clear Blizzard didn't want to depend on it alone for Tier 7, adding 2 other small raids to the tier to support it, both of which make up my next spots, the first being Eye of Eternity. Look, I have to be real for a second here. The Blue Dragonflight is my all-time favorite Dragonflight. Dragons like Saffron and Sindragoza are just super cool to me, but it's Big Daddy Malygos that made me fall in love with them to begin with. Oh, we have to kill him, huh?
I remember the truth. A warm December with you, but I don't have to make this mistake.
While it really bummed me out to have to kill Malygos, at least Blizzard made an extremely satisfying boss fight to mend the hole in my heart. EoE is a simple raid. There isn't any trash, nor are there any hallways or areas to get lost in. It's one platform and one boss encounter. While that may seem a little too simplistic and boring, Malygos' boss fight offers a head-spinning, exciting little adventure with a very solid difficulty spike when compared to Naxx 25. One of the most solid things about this encounter is just how different he is from the other dragon encounters that happened before and even after him, lacking a tail swipe like most traditional bosses, and focusing more on AoE damage and mechanic management to defeat him. His first phase saw your raid controlling sparks that would buff the boss if he ate it, while healing through and surviving his massive AoE damage, including his gigantic vortex attack. After this, players were tasked with using magical discs to fly into the air and attack the mages that came into the arena, before finally hopping onto red drakes to fight him in his final form after he destroys the platform. It may not have had a lot of substance when it comes to the raid content outside of the boss encounter, but this one boss fight ended up being epic, fun, and most of all extremely memorable, all wrapped into one. The other entry raid alongside EoE and Naxx was Obsidian Sanctum, or as a lot of people know it, Sarth. And while it has some problems, it also has some of the best memories I have of World of Warcraft. Right out the gate, OS, much like EoE, is one of those boss rush style raids, though unlike EoE, it features other content to do outside of just the boss. Boasting 3 mini-bosses and a large amount of trash pulls, this helped to add a little bit of padding to the dungeon. The design is simplistic and harkens back to Molten Core in a lot of ways with a very volcanic design and color scheme, but fits the overall concept well. The boss himself is pretty solid, featuring a small amount of mechanics including his famous, or in some cases, infamous lava waves. God, I can remember people sucking at that mechanic. While it seems decent on paper, it has a few minor issues. Its mini-bosses are a little too simplistic in my opinion, and the final boss himself is overly easy. But there is a minor detail I left out that affects this. The reason both the mini-bosses and Sarth are overly simplistic is because there's a hard mode encounter hidden within. If you clear all the trash and then aggro Sarth without killing his drakes, you activate Sarth 1, 2, or 3 drakes. This version of the encounter is much more challenging, and upon its release was one of WoW's hardest encounters, boasting high damage output from the boss as well as a need for very high DPS on your raid's part. It was no easy task to claim you had down 1 or 2 drakes, let alone 3 at the time of its release, but man, it felt good when you finally did it. Sarth may not be complex on paper or as fun as Maly goes, but it's how the boss challenged new players as well as existing ones that makes it a fantastic little raid. Blizzard added a bunch of new questing zones in Wrath, but in addition added the first world PvP zone, Wintergrasp, and with it, its own little raid instance known as Vault of Archavon. Vault was an ever-expanding raid instance that at launch only featured the aforementioned boss, Archavon, and a few minor trash pulls. But with every huge raid patch that followed, minus Ruby Sanctum, new bosses and trash mobs were added with updated loot, giving players a reason to return to Archavon long after they outgeared it. In addition to traditional PvE loot, it also dropped PvP loot, which made the PvP grind a little easier for those who were focusing mostly on player versus player. The design is pretty linear, but features that charming Titanic architecture I mentioned earlier when talking about Ulduar. The bosses are pretty simple on paper, and outside of Emmelon I never really remember pug groups I was in having that many issues with them. Their mechanics weren't overly complex and were very pug friendly. While I wouldn't say Vault is an amazing or even great raid, it served its purpose well as a free loot raid, and its constant updates meant that it was never overly offensive or stale. While everything up to this point was either amazing, great, or, decent, everything after this point feels kinda lackluster and shoot in, and Ruby Sanctum is our first offender. I want to go on record and say now, I don't hate Ruby Sanctum. It's not terrible or even offensive, it's just kind of meh. First off, visually, it's not a bad looking raid, having a very vibrant red dragonflight aesthetic to it, and it shares a similar layout to its brother raid Obsidian Sanctum, featuring a series of mini-bosses and trash clears as well. Much like OS, the focus is only on one boss, this time the Twilight Dragon Halion, and overall his boss fight isn't really terrible. Players must do battle with his standard form before also battling him within his Twilight realm, while dodging cutter beams. God, I hate cutter beams. Looking at you, Sinistra, you monster. But here lies the problem. While it isn't terrible, it feels like it's missing something, and it is. Obsidian Sanctum got away with this more drab layout and boss format because you could add mini-bosses to the final encounter for a more challenging experience with better loot. Halion does not possess this mechanic, not to mention this raid came out after the Lich King was on farm, and not long before the next expansion Cataclysm was released, leaving Halion and Ruby Sanctum nothing more than a bump in the road most of us just don't care to remember. While Naxxramas received a lot of respect for its second chance at something a lot of people didn't get to try, I don't think there was much clamoring among fans for the same to be done to Onyxia's Lair. As I've voiced before, I'm not a big fan of Onyxia, and maybe that hurt my feelings when I ranked it in my vanilla video, but the return in Wrath isn't any better. In fact, it may be worse than the original. While Onyxia is a decent boss on her own, I would never argue that she's all that complex or even fun. She featured 3 phases, 2 ground phases in her middle aerial phase, and while that's all decently made, it feels very lackluster when stacked up against other raids in Wrath of the Lich King. The loot is all tier 2 replicas, but without the interesting set bonuses the original tier 2 offered, meaning you were better off clearing TOC for tier 9 instead. and the raid is still kind of an eyesore in my opinion, having that very orange bloom look to it that I hated so much in the original and in Molten Core. At least she was memorable in the original version of her raid and made some solid memes. Too bad her outing in Wrath of the Lich King was lackluster and forgettable, but at least, much like the original, she was done and over with long before she became stale. While several of the raids I've talked about had some nasty problems, none of them beat out the infamy of Trial of the Crusader. If there's a checklist of things not to do in a raid, TOC is going to check off a lot of the boxes. Its raid design is lackluster and 90% of it is unchanging, boring, simple looking arena design. It lacks any trash or padding at all, and overall the experience is lacking any real energy or thought. I will give TOC credit, the bosses aren't terrible for the most part. Bosses like Jaraxxus and Anubarak are all real fun, and have engaging mechanics to learn and master. And with the introduction of the heroic raiding mechanic, this meant players could tackle these bosses on additional difficulties with even more loot. The heroic mode also brought with it the tribute chests, which, if players played properly and did not wipe, allowed them to get bonus loot at the end of the raid. This promoted repeated attempts and improved performance and mastery. But even this isn't perfect, as bosses at times could be cruel or downright broken. Faction champs? I mean, as much as I appreciate a PvP style boss, the CC was ridiculous and sometimes things just go wrong, inevitably punishing the raid and denying them one of their chests. TOC is a perfect example of Blizzard attempting something new but ultimately dropping the ball, and sadly we were all the ones left around standing, wondering why it had to be such a lackluster, barren, and painful experience. Honestly, the worst part for me is getting to the end and seeing Asjil Nerub in the background behind Anubarak, and knowing they could have added so much more to this raid, like an underground complex of Nerubian mazes to explore and fight through. But sadly, that's not what we got. We got a shell of a raid with very little content that was expected to be spread out over an entire tier. Well, that's it. I ranked all of the Wrath of the Lich King raid content. While I am happy to have ranked all this content, it's you guys that I want to hear from now in the comments. What were your favorite and least favorite raids in Wrath? Drop them in the comments and let's talk about it. Well, it's about time for me to start working on the Cataclysm raids, and oh boy, I can hardly wait. Oh boy. As always, I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.